The Nexus Station Artisan Workshop hummed with the kind of organized chaos that would make a symphony conductor weep with envy. If symphony conductors were 8-foot-tall crystalline beings with perfect pitch and an unfortunate tendency to shatter when overly emotional. Which, coincidentally, Maestro Valthera was, though she'd learned to keep her emotional outbursts to a minimum after the Great Crescendo incident. Floating serenely in the workshop's central bay, the station's artificial gravity generators worked overtime to accommodate 17 different species' gravitational preferences. The result was a delightfully nauseating patchwork of gravity wells that would have Einstein reaching for the nearest waste receptacle. But the artisans had grown accustomed to the peculiar dance of stepping from standard gravity into the Zephyrian low-G zones, then immediately adjusting to the crushing 3.2 G preferred by the Granite Consortium representative. At Workbench 7, Axeler the Magnificent, a title he'd given himself after his third apprenticeship, delicately adjusted the quantum resonance frequency of what appeared to be a crystalline flower. The Zephyrian's 6 arms moved with practiced precision, each manipulating a different tool while his primary consciousness split across multiple probability matrices. His species had mastered the art of existing in 17 different dimensions simultaneously, which made them excellent at detailed work and absolutely terrible at dinner parties. Another masterpiece for the Endorian embassy, Axeler announced to no one in particular, his voice echoing through harmonics that technically didn't exist in normal space-time. They specifically requested something that captures the essence of their homeworld's dying sun. Apparently apocalyptic beauty is very fashionable this season. 3 benches over, Grixalos, a member of the notoriously practical Dyrothian species, looked up from what appeared to be a metallic sculpture engaged in a heated argument with itself. The Dyrothians had evolved from pack hunters on a planet where everything, including the rocks, had developed social hierarchies. This made them excellent team players, and gave their artwork an unfortunate tendency toward committee-based decision-making. Fashion, Grixalos rumbled, each word vibrating through the harmonic frequencies that kept the station's hull integrity intact. The hegemony requests a new hyperdrive housing that's both functionally superior and aesthetically pleasing, and the Endorians want decorative representations of cosmic extinction events. Sometimes I wonder if the universe has developed a sense of irony just to spite us. The workshop's new addition, a human apprentice who'd arrived 3 months ago through what the bureaucrats cheerfully called the Cultural Integration Initiative, and everyone else called that thing where we pretend inferior species might contribute something useful, continued her work at the corner bench. She'd been assigned the galaxy's most thrilling task, organizing spare quantum stabilizers by dimensional variant. It was the kind of job typically reserved for punishment detail, except the Foreman had run out of ways to punish people and decided to see if the human might actually be useful for something. The human designation Earth Human Female Apprentice Level 1 extremely unlikely to advance, had yet to speak above a whisper since her arrival. This had led to considerable speculation among the artisans about whether her species communicated primarily through barely audible mumblings, or if she was simply overwhelmed by the magnificence of their operation. The betting pools had reached considerable proportions, with Axeler convinced she was telepathic, and Grixalos maintaining she was probably just slow. Around the workshop, the day's projects continued with the usual mixture of genius and barely controlled catastrophe. The Veltari Crystal Singers worked on a commissioned piece that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously, a wedding gift for a Centauri politician who'd apparently made the mistake of marrying someone from a parallel universe. The Nexari bioshapers crafted living sculptures that would mature over centuries, provided they remembered to feed them and occasionally take them for walks through hyperspace. At the environmental controls, Eukandra of the Photosynthetic Collective maintained the atmospheric conditions that kept 17 different species from either suffocating, freezing, burning, or achieving spontaneous dimensional transcendence. Her species had evolved on a planet where the weather was controlled by committee vote, making them naturally suited for complex environmental management, and utterly incapable of making dinner reservations. The workshop's reputation extended across 12 sectors of the galaxy. Diplomats, merchants, and occasionally terrifying warlords commissioned pieces that would demonstrate their sophisticated taste and enormous wealth. The waiting list stretched longer than some species' evolutionary timelines, and the prices made entire planetary economies weep. But despite all this cosmic grandeur and artistic magnificence, the human apprentice remained focused on her task of sorting quantum stabilizers. She worked with methodical precision, occasionally glancing up to observe the other artisans' techniques before returning to her seemingly endless inventory of spare parts. Her movements were efficient, economical, and though none of the established craftsmen had noticed, remarkably thoughtful. The morning shift continued with its usual rhythm of creative breakthroughs, minor explosions, and the occasional need to evacuate sections of the workshop when someone's artistic vision achieved sentience and demanded workers' rights. Just another typical day in the galaxy's premier artisan collective, where the impossible was routine and the routine was generally impossible. None of them suspected that their carefully ordered hierarchy was about to face its most significant challenge from the quietest corner of their magnificent workshop. The morning's creative chaos ground to an abrupt halt when Foreman Bexoth, resonance chamber activated with the sort of harmonic frequency that suggested either an important announcement or someone had accidentally weaponized the coffee machine again. The massive Corothian's shell-plated form dominated the workshop's central platform, his 4 optical sensors sweeping across the assembled artisans with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent 3 decades turning impossible requests into marginally probable nightmares. Craftsman Bexothel's voice rumbled through subsonic frequencies that made the quantum stabilizers vibrate in sympathetic harmony. We have received a commission that will either cement our reputation as the galaxy's premier artisan collective, or provide our competitors with amusing stories to tell at trade conference. The artisans exchanged glances, a remarkably complex social interaction when 17 different species have evolved completely different definitions of glancing. Haxother's probability matrices shifted into defensive configurations, while Grixoth's pack-mind began calculating threat assessments. Even Eukondra's photosynthetic processes slowed to a concerned rustle. The Hegemony Council, Bexothel continued, his tone carrying the weight of civilizations, has commissioned a new class of deep space exploration vessel. They require a navigation system that can function in uncharted space, beyond the reach of standard stellar cartography networks. The system must be compact, efficient, and he paused for dramatic effect, which was impressive considering his species communicated primarily through seismic vibrations, capable of learning. A collective intake of breath, or the closest equivalent among species that breathed everything from methane to crystallized time, swept through the workshop. Adaptive navigation systems were the holy grail of galactic engineering, the sort of breakthrough that launched civilizations into new eras, or more commonly, launched engineering teams into extended therapy sessions. The deadline, Bexothel added with the casual tone reserved for announcing universal entropy, is 6 standard weeks. Now the silence took on the quality of a vacuum, not the peaceful emptiness of space, but the sort of aggressive nothingness that preceded either genius or catastrophic failure, possibly both simultaneously, which had happened before and resulted in the great paradox of 2384 that philosophers were still arguing about. Haxother was the first to respond, his 6 arms beginning the complex gestures that accompanied Zephyrian deep thinking. Foreman, with respect to your magnificent wisdom and the obviously superior judgment of the Hegemony Council, adaptive navigation systems have been theoretical for approximately 4,000 standard years. The computational requirements alone would. I'm aware of the challenges, Bexothel interrupted, his subsonic frequencies taking on the patient tone of someone explaining physics to a particularly dense asteroid, which is why I'm opening this commission to the entire workshop of collaborative effort. Pool our resources, combine our expertise, achieve the impossible through the power of organized panic. The next 3 days dissolved into a blur of frantic activity that would have impressed chaos theorists and terrified anyone with a functioning survival instinct. The workshop's various species threw themselves at the problem with the sort of desperate creativity that emerged when reputation, career advancement, and the possibility of not being fed to the hegemony's pet space kraken hung in the balance. The Velthuri crystal singers attempted to create a navigation matrix that existed in harmonic resonance with the universe's fundamental frequency. Their first prototype achieved sentience, filed a formal complaint about working conditions, and demanded compensation for unauthorized consciousness generation. Their second prototype simply screamed for 47 hours straight before dissolving into component particles. The Nexari bioshapers engineered living navigation organisms that could theoretically adapt to any stellar environment, Unfortunately, their creations kept evolving beyond their original parameters. The first batch developed a taste for starship hull. The second batch formed a union and went on strike. The third batch achieved dimensional transcendence and left behind nothing but a strongly worded resignation letter, written in quantum foam. Grixot's pack-mind approach yielded a navigation system based on collective intelligence principle. The prototype worked brilliantly until the individual components started developing personality conflicts. Navigation decisions began requiring committee votes, complete with parliamentary procedures and filibuster rules. Test flights took 17 times longer due to procedural debates, and one simulation ended when the navigation system split into opposing political parties. Even Yixandra's environmental specialists contributed, attempting to create navigation systems that could photosynthesize stellar radiation into computational energy. Their efforts produced a device that could indeed learn and adapt, but only during specific solar seasons, and with adequate water and fertilizer. The prototype also kept trying to put down roots in the starship's hull and occasionally bloomed, which was beautiful but hardly practical for interstellar navigation. By the end of week 4, the workshop resembled the aftermath of a creativity explosion that had collided head-on with a logic implosion. Workbenches overflowed with failed prototypes, abandoned theories, and the occasional device that worked perfectly but only on alternate Tuesdays, when the cosmic background radiation felt cooperative. The human apprentice continued her assigned duties throughout the chaos, methodically cataloging the mounting failures while maintaining her characteristic silence. She observed each attempt with careful attention, occasionally making notes in a primitive paper notebook, a quaint throwback to pre-digital civilizations that the other artisans found simultaneously charming and ridiculous. On Friday of week 4, with 2 weeks remaining until the deadline and the workshop's collective sanity hanging by increasingly frayed threads, Bexthal called another assembly. His resonance chamber's harmonic frequency carried the distinctive undertones of someone preparing to deliver either inspiration or termination notices. "Fellow artisans," he began, his subsonic rumbles carrying across the workshop's improbable gravity fields, "we find ourselves facing a challenge that has humbled even our considerable collective expertise. Perhaps it's time to consider alternative approaches." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility, failure, and the sort of desperate hope that preceded either breakthrough moments or spectacular disaster. In that silence, 17 different species contemplated their professional mortality, while one human apprentice quietly closed her notebook and cleared her throat with the sort of soft sound that somehow carried across the entire workshop. For the first time since her arrival, every optical sensor, compound eye, and probability detection matrix in the workshop focused on the quiet figure in the corner. The hierarchy that had seemed so permanent suddenly felt as fragile as crystallized time in a gravity storm. The human apprentice rose from her corner workbench with the sort of measured movement that suggested either profound confidence or complete obliviousness to the cosmic significance of the moment. Given that her species had somehow managed to achieve interstellar travel despite possessing brains roughly the size of a Zephyrian probability calculator, either option seemed equally plausible. "Foreman Bexthal," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the workshop without benefit of harmonic amplifiers, subsonic resonance chambers, or quantum vocal enhancement. The primitive simplicity of basic atmospheric vibration struck the assembled artisans as either charmingly quaint or deeply unsettling. "I believe I understand the navigation problem." Bexthal's 4 optical sensors focused with the sort of attention typically reserved for impending natural disasters or tax audits. "Apprentice, while we appreciate your enthusiasm, this challenge has proven beyond even our most experienced craftsmen." "Yes," she replied with the matter-of-fact tone that her species used for everything from discussing weather to announcing the heat death of the universe. "That's exactly the problem." The workshop's silence took on new dimensions of confusion. Haxler's probability matrices began calculating the likelihood that the human had achieved some form of dimensional madness, while Grixot's pack-mind wondered if this was what species-wide nervous breakdowns looked like among primitive bipeds. The apprentice walked to the central platform, her movement creating tiny gravitational ripples as she passed between the various species' preferred gravity wells. In her hands she carried what appeared to be a collection of discarded components, failed experiments, broken prototypes, and spare parts that had been deemed too primitive for serious consideration. "You've all been trying to create the perfect navigation system," she continued, beginning to assemble the components with movements that seemed random, but somehow purposeful. "Adaptive, learning, capable of handling any scenario the universe might present. The problem is that perfection requires predicting every possible variable, and the universe has a rather impressive talent for generating variables nobody thought to predict." She connected a Veltari crystal resonator to a Nexari bioprocessor using what appeared to be standard copper wiring, a material so primitive that most civilizations used it for decorative purposes or emergency dental filling. The combination should have been completely incompatible, yet somehow the connections held and began generating a low, steady hum. "My species," she said while adding a Dorothian collective processing unit to the growing assemblage, "never achieved perfect navigation system. We couldn't even achieve adequate ones most of the time. Our early space explorers got lost with such regularity that exploration and accidentally wandering into the void became essentially synonymous terms. Ysandra's photosynthetic processes rustled with what might have been amusement or concern. Then how did you manage interstellar travel? We got very good at figuring out where we were after we got lost." The human's smile carried the sort of casual confidence that her species displayed when discussing their various failures to achieve basic competence. "We developed navigation systems that didn't try to prevent getting lost. They just got extremely efficient at getting unlocked." She began incorporating elements from each failed prototype into her assemblage. The screaming Veltari crystal went quiet when connected to the unionized Nexari organism, which suddenly found productive work to do. The politically divided Dorothian collective discovered that their opposing viewpoints actually provided excellent error checking when filtered through the human's copper wiring. "The navigation system doesn't need to know where it's going," she explained while the device began taking shape, not the elegant symmetrical form preferred by advanced civilizations, but something that looked like it had been assembled by particularly creative scavengers. "It needs to be exceptionally good at figuring out where it is and where it's been. Everything else is just extrapolation." The device hummed, clicked, rustled and made several sounds that didn't technically exist in normal space-time. But unlike the previous prototypes that had achieved sentience, formed unions or screamed themselves out of existence, this one simply worked. It processed stellar cartography data, adapted to new input parameters, and demonstrated the sort of reliable functionality that advanced civilizations had somehow forgotten in their pursuit of perfection. Haxler's probability matrices performed calculations that hurt to contemplate. But the computational requirements for real-time adaptation are handled by making mistakes quickly and correcting them faster, the human interrupted. "My species spent millennia getting lost and finding ourselves again. We became extremely efficient at it." She activated a holographic display that showed the navigation system's decision-making process. Instead of the complex mathematical elegance preferred by advanced civilizations, it resembled something between organized chaos and controlled panic. The system made rapid approximations, discovered errors, corrected course, made new mistakes, and adapted continuously, all while maintaining forward progress toward its intended destination. "It's not perfect," she said, watching the display with the sort of fond attention other species reserved for masterpieces. "It makes mistakes constant, but it makes them fast enough to correct them before they become catastrophic, and it learns from each error without getting paralyzed by the possibility of future mistakes." Grisana's pack mind struggled to process the implication. "You've created a navigation system that succeeds by failing efficiently." "Welcome to human engineering philosophy," she replied cheerfully. "We've been succeeding by failing better for approximately 10,000 years. It's taken us this long to realize that other species might find the approach useful." The assembled artisans stared at the device with expressions that ranged from amazement to existential crisis. The navigation system continued its cheerful process of making rapid mistakes, correcting them instantly, and somehow maintaining perfect course accuracy while doing so. Dexonis' resonance chamber produced harmonics that suggested profound contemplation mixed with professional bewilderment. "Apprentice, this is actually working." "Of course it is," she said with the casual confidence of someone whose species had turned productive failure into an art form. Sometimes the solution to impossible problems is realizing they're only impossible if you insist on solving them perfectly. The workshop's carefully maintained hierarchy trembled as 17 advanced civilizations contemplated the possibility that they'd been overthinking things for several thousand years. The Hegemony Council's response arrived precisely 47 hours later, delivered via priority quantum burst transmission that bypassed 17 layers of bureaucratic protocol and arrived directly on Foreman Bexthel's personal resonance chamber. This was either an excellent sign or a prelude to the sort of cosmic-scale displeasure that typically resulted in entire star systems being reclassified as learning experiences. The message began with the traditional hegemony greeting, which involved approximately 6 minutes of harmonic frequencies that roughly translated to "We acknowledge your continued existence and find it marginally acceptable." What followed, however, departed dramatically from standard hegemony communication protocols. The prototype navigation system, the message continued in frequencies that suggested barely contained excitement, has exceeded performance parameters by factors that our mathematicians are still calculating. Initial testing in the void reach sector, previously considered unnavigable, resulted in perfect course accuracy with a computational efficiencies that makes our existing systems appear to be powered by particularly ambitious hamsters. Bexthel's subsonic rumble carried across the workshop with the sort of harmonic undertones that suggested professional vindication mixed with existential confusion. The assembled artisans gathered around the central platform, their various methods of locomotion creating a bizarre parade of sliding, floating, skittering, and occasionally teleporting beings converging on the announcement. Further, the message continued with the relentless precision that made hegemony communication simultaneously impressive and deeply unsettling. Preliminary analysis suggests that the navigation system's productive failure methodology could be adapted to numerous other technological challenges. The Council has authorized immediate expansion of the research program and requests detailed documentation of the design philosophy. The human apprentice, who had returned to her corner workbench with the sort of casual demeanor her species displayed after casually revolutionizing galactic technology, looked up from her resumed task of organizing quantum stabilized. "Oh," she said with the mild surprise typically reserved for discovering slightly stale bread. They liked it. Haxaller's probability matrices performed calculations that bordered on the spiritually transcendent. Like, the Hegemony Council just described our most advanced navigation systems as hamster-powered. This is either the greatest triumph in workshop history, or the beginning of a philosophical crisis that will require therapy for entire civilization. "Probably both," the human replied cheerfully, returning to her sorting with the sort of focused attention that other species used for meditation or achieving cosmic enlightenment. "My species tends to have that effect on established systems." The workshop's social dynamics underwent the sort of fundamental restructuring typically associated with tectonic shifts, or the occasional collapse of space-time itself. Griximos PacMind began incorporating human problem-solving methodologies into their collective decision-making process. The Velsari crystal singers discovered that introducing controlled disharmony into their resonance patterns actually improved their artistic range. Even Yochandra's environmental collective started experimenting with managed ecosystem failures that somehow resulted in more robust stability. Word spread through the artisan community with the velocity of gossip traveling through a black hole's event horizon. The Nexus Station workshop had achieved something that advanced civilizations had considered theoretically impossible. They'd solved an unsolvable problem by embracing the art of solving it imperfectly. Within 3 weeks, delegations from 12 different species arrived to study the human methodology. They came expecting to find revolutionary new technologies or transcendent philosophical insights. Instead, they discovered an approach so fundamentally simple that it bordered on the ridiculous. Make mistakes quickly, learn from them faster, and keep moving forward despite the certainty of continued error. The Andromedans, whose civilization had spent 4,000 years pursuing perfect mathematical harmony, experienced what their philosophers later termed productive cognitive dissonance. Their subsequent technological advances incorporated planned obsolescence and iterative improvement cycles that tripled their innovation rate, while reducing their collective anxiety about achieving perfection. The Crystalline Confederation, masters of precise harmonic resonance, began experimenting with controlled discord that somehow enhanced their communication network's adaptability. Their message transmission systems became more reliable by acknowledging that some messages would inevitably get garbled, then becoming exceptionally good at detecting and correcting errors in real time. Even the notoriously rigid geometric orthodoxy, a civilization that had based their entire culture on perfect mathematical relationships, began incorporating uncertainty coefficients into their planning process. Their cities became more livable, their transportation more efficient, and their citizens considerably less stressed about maintaining geometric perfection in their daily lives. The human apprentice, meanwhile, had been officially promoted from apprentice level 1 extremely unlikely to advance to senior design consultant specialist in productive failure methodologies. A title so new that the workshop's administrative systems had to be completely reprogrammed to accommodate it. It's fascinating, Bexthal observed during one of their regular design consultations, how your species achieved interstellar capability despite appearing to approach every challenge through organized catastrophe. Oh, we don't just appear to, she replied with the sort of cheerful honesty that made other species question their fundamental assumptions about competence. We actually do approach everything through organized catastrophe. The trick is getting good enough at organizing the catastrophe that it becomes indistinguishable from success. The workshop's reputation evolved from premier artisan collective to the place where impossible problems go to discover they were only difficult. The waiting list for commissions extended beyond the heat death of several small galaxies, and the prices achieved levels that made entire economic systems reconsider their understanding of value. But perhaps the most significant change was philosophical. The galactic community's pursuit of perfection, that ancient drive that had motivated civilizations for millennia, began incorporating the radical concept that perfection might not be a destination but rather a process of becoming progressively better at handling imperfection. As Bexthal noted in his quarterly report to the Galactic Artisan Guild, we have learned that the most advanced solution to advanced problems may be surprisingly simple. Admit that you don't know everything, expect to make mistakes, and become exceptionally good at fixing them quickly. It appears that one species' history of productive failure has become everyone's blueprint for productive success. The human apprentice continued her work, now designing systems that succeeded by failing better, while the galaxy slowly adapted to the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, they'd been making things more complicated than necessary for several thousand years. Sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the quietest voice suggesting that everyone might be overthinking things.